So Ryan Barrett is the Research and Agronomy Specialist with the Prince Edward Island Potato Board in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. In this role, he coordinates local and national research projects with a number of different partners, as well as conducting on-farm research trials with a number of PEI potato growers. Ryan graduated with a BSc Agri from the Dalhousie Faculty of Agriculture in 2002 and an MSc from the University of Guelph in 2004. He has worked with the PEI Potato Board since 2012 after previously working in the purebred dairy cattle industry. As well, he continues to be involved in his family's dairy farm in Belmont Lot 16, breeding registered milking shorthorns. Ryan also serves as Secretary Manager of the Canadian Milking Shorthorn Society. Ryan is a professional agrologist and serves as the Vice President of the PEI Institute of Agrologists and will be representing PEI later on today when we hear from the institutes. He's also a certified crop advisor for the Atlantic Provinces and serves on the board of directors for the Potato Association of America, the Prince Edward Island 4-H Council, and the Dalhousie Faculty of Agriculture Alumni Committee. Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks, Rosalie. You'll have to bear with me a little bit this morning. I yesterday found out that COVID has made its way to my house, so I'm not feeling too bad, so I'm doing it from home and we're making do. So anyway, I'm here to talk to you today about fall cover crop strategies for Atlantic Canada. I was actually able to do most of this presentation in a slightly modified way with growers and producers in PEI last week through the Federation. So hopefully we're on track for or we've already kind of tested this out, and hopefully you'll find it as interesting as they did. So today, in terms of defining cover crops, so my presentation is largely going to focus on fall cover crops, and crops following either a cash crop harvest or following, say, like a late summer, early fall tillage. I'm going to touch on interseeded crops, like say under grain corn or with soybeans or something like that. In terms of full season cover crops, I generally tend to refer to these as soil building crops or service crops. And I think our next speaker is maybe going to talk about that a little bit as well. But I'm not going to touch on that as much here, just because, you know, there's different provinces have different eligibility for these types of full season cover crops. And we see them maybe a little bit, we already see them kind of as a standard practice in in potato rotations, as a lot of forages grown in potato rotations, a lot of other sort of soil building crops. So I'm not going to focus on that as much, focus more today on the fall cover crops. So why fall cover crops? Of course, a lot of it's pretty common sense stuff. I'm going to touch on each of these points in detail here in a minute. But you know, some of it may be fairly straightforward for a lot of you, and some of it may be something that maybe you hadn't thought about. So number one with a bullet when it comes to fall cover crops is we're preventing soil erosion. It's the most important facet of improving soil health, is to keep soil in the field, keep it from moving. The soil that's most likely to erode is also the soil that's the most fertile, carries the most nutrients, and has the highest organic matter. So if we can keep that soil in the field, it's going to do the most in terms of keeping soil, improving soil health. And fall covers do play a role in helping to protect from water and wind erosion. Even if it's just something, even if it's just a few inches, it's something to help prevent soil erosion, particularly if you can get some root mass there before the winter. Any amount is better than nothing. Of course, we always want more, but trying to get something on before freeze up is great. In some living lab trials that I did as part of the Living Labs Atlantic project here in PEI, we saw about 50% less soil accumulation in these splash pans that you see in the photos on the right-hand side of the image here. We saw 50% less soil accumulation where we had a cover crop than a no cover crop treatment. And that's because, you know, where you've got that living cover, it's intercepting the rain, it's causing less disturbance on the surface of the soil to dislodge soil into that sort of trough that you see in those splash pans. So it's just it's a coarse example of where we can see reduced susceptibility to erosion. We don't like to see fields like this. You know, this is actually a reasonably flat field without a whole lot of, you know, not a big long run of concentrated flow, but we do see significant erosion gullies in this field, where there was no cover after potato harvest. The little bit of, stems on the top, vines on the top isn't stopping too much erosion. And again, this is that same field, and this is actually a trial where we had part of the field had a cover crop on the left and part didn't. And you can see that by spring, there's not too much cover crop there. There's a little tinge of green here and there, but there was enough cover there in the fall to hold that soil over the winter, so that we don't have the same erosion, that real erosion in those gullies that we see on the right-hand side. When we're talking about reducing nitrogen losses, so there's two different types of nitrogen loss we get from the field. So by having a cover crop following either harvest or legume plow down, we keep nitrates from leaching. So in Prince Edward Island, with our sandy soil, that's particularly a challenge. If you have leftover nitrates in the soil after harvest, or after, say, plowing down or tilling down alfalfa or something like that, that nitrogen is mostly gone by the springtime. There's very little of that left. And so if we can have a cover crop to help sequester that nitrogen, those nitrates, and take them up and carry them over to the next year, that's a benefit not only to the environment, but also to the farmer in terms of hopefully having a nitrogen, going back into that production system, go back into future crops. Also, cover crops can do a lot in terms of preventing loss of nitrogen as nitrous oxide, which we know is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So if we can, again, have a living cover on that field during the year, we're much less likely to have off-gassing of nitrous oxide. So in some of our trial fields where we did cover crops after potatoes, we saw soil nitrates reduced by up to 40% where there was a cover crop versus a no cover crop, because those cover crops uptake that soil nitrate and kept it from leaving the system. Building soil carbon, in the last number of years, many of you probably will have seen reports and read some papers on this in the last little while, but a lot of the more recent research has shown that the majority of soil carbon is built from root exudates and microbial biomass, not by above ground residue. So historically, we had a lot of people really focused on getting as much above ground biomass as they can, leaving it in the field, whether it's leaving the straw in the field, leaving mulched hay in the field, whatever they could do to leave that in the field. But to leave that in the field and put that into the soil, they were doing 2 and 3 tillage events. Well, now we understand that it's way more important to have reduced tillage and as much green material in the field living for as long as possible in the year, that will build the soil carbon a lot faster than incorporating a lot of trash or a lot of residue into the field. So if we can establish cover crops in the shoulder season with limited to no tillage, that can give us an extra 2 to 3 months of actively growing plants, and that has the potential to fix or to sequester more carbon in our soils. So this is an example of a trial that was done over many years, actually, by Dr. Laura Van Erd and her colleagues at Ridgetown College with the University of Guelph. And they were able to show that in a 4-year rotation, done for 8 years, where they had cover crops in 6 out of the 8 years, they were able to increase soil carbon by between 11 to 22% in their plots, where they had covers versus no covers. And that's pretty, those are pretty interesting numbers. And they were starting with reasonably good, organic matter levels especially by PEI conditions or PEI standards. So you can see in the table on the right there, their no cover treatment where they had no cover crops, I'm going to call that the check. They're at about 3.4% organic matter. And where they've had oats and radish, they've gained about, a little around 0.2% over those 8 years. And the radish and the rye, they're up to, 0.35 or somewhere in that range. In the fall rye, we're up over 0.4. Those are really big increases in a relatively short amount of time, by the standards of what we're looking at. And I know for a lot of farms here in PEI, if they could increase organic matter by, 0.4 in 10 years, they'd be ecstatic. So, and that's by, still, in these rotations, they had a cash crop every year, but they're just maximizing the amount of cover cropping that we're going to do. And when you compare that with retaining straw, so again, I was talking about, retaining those residues in the field, they still help, and they still were associated with an increase in soil carbon, but only at about a third, to a sixth of the rate as what they were able to develop from cover cropping. just a very brief example of some work that we've done here in PEI, and don't take this to the bank by any means yet, but in where we were looking at covers ahead of potatoes versus no covers. And so we were looking at covers being established late August, early September, where we had a no cover crop in the field versus right next to it a cover crop. We saw about a 0.1 increase in organic matter just in 1 year. Now again, I'm not going to take that to the bank right now. This is just we're looking at trends. I haven't even done the full stats on this yet, but we are seeing a positive trend towards building organic matter. And I think just it definitely helps. It's definitely going to go in the right direction. You'll likely see more response or more degree of response in what I would call compromised fields or low organic matter fields. The fields that were chosen in this trial were largely low organic matter fields because they were fields that they wanted to try and make, to try to come ahead on to try and improve. So maybe we'd see a larger degree, especially in our sort of sandy soils here in PEI. You might see a more rapid increase at low levels, and then at higher organic matter levels, you might not see the same response. But just indicating that there may be a positive trend that we need to keep looking at, and that's encouraging for growers going forward. I talked a little bit about weed suppression. So we do know that there are some species of crops like fall rye and buckwheat that are alleliopathic in terms of directly inhibiting weed growth, and in different ways and different degrees. Fall rye, been well known for a long time as an alleliopathic crop that can suppress weeds. We also are seeing some of that benefit in mustard and radish. I'm not really sure if it's the same, if it's direct alleliopathy, or whether it's just that they outcompete the weeds, that they, shade out the weeds a bit, especially if established early. The photo I have here on the right, you can see on the right-hand side of that photo, you can see there's a lot more green than there is on the left. The right is our no cover check that was from fall of 2021, and the left was planted with daikon or tillage radish in the fall of 2021. And so this picture is taken this spring when we were out soil sampling, and you can see on that right hand side where there was no cover, there's quite a bit more this field was wheat in 2021, so there's some volunteer wheat growing in there. There's also barnyard grass, and there's couch grass, and there's some lamb's quarters and some other weeds in there. And so we definitely saw through the season in that field fewer weeds where they had the cover crop the year before, and they ended up with a significant yield difference in this field from where they had the cover versus where they didn't have the cover as well. Pest suppression, we know that in Prince Edward Island we have quite a few people using brown mustard or buckwheat for wireworm control, especially in areas where wireworms are really a big consideration. Brown mustard is probably the better choice for a fall cover, say maybe established in August and September. Buckwheat is not frost tolerant, so it doesn't make as good a choice for that, but maybe for early season it can help. There is also some evidence that your oilseeds, your daikon radishes can help suppress some soil-borne diseases, things like rhizoctonia in potatoes and black scurf, that sort of thing. So we have a little bit more to figure out on that too, but it does seem to be associated with some things. The one proviso I would say is that maybe not having a brassica directly ahead of a brassica main crop, so not having radish or mustard ahead of canola or rutabaga or broccoli or brown mustard or one of those sorts of things. And of course, hand in hand with building soil organic matter is feeding the soil microbiome itself. So we know that soil microbiome, if we foster it, if we build it, it has a massive role in nutrient cycling and making certain nutrients more available to the crop. Maybe particularly micronutrients or nutrients that are lacking in some way, or making them more available. And then, in potato production, we know that there are certain, interactions in the microbial community that can affect diseases like common scab, which is a bacterial caused disease. And so if we can outcompete some of the bad actors with the good actors by again, fostering that community, having as much biomass and as much living biomass as possible, that's going to help. We have a lot to learn about how microbes interact with plants and the role of, sort of their population communities and that sort of thing, and more of that work's being done all the time. But if we can keep priming our microbial community and keep them active through the season, I think that's only going to be a benefit. And then when we talk about increasing yields, so there's been a lot of questions about this over the time. Does using fall covers, do they help with yields? Can they suppress yields? So in terms of from SARE, many of you will be familiar with SARE in the United States, from their 2019-2020 report, and this is surveys from growers, they found that following cover crops versus no cover crops, they had about a 5% yield improvement in soybeans, 2% in corn, 2.6% in wheat. They have reported bigger yield increases in other years, especially following more challenging years or drought years. So those numbers can be they've reported them up to 7-8%. In the UK, we've been following some work that's been done with the NAIB group over there on cover crops before potatoes. And again, over many site years, many farms, they've seen cover crops increase potato yield by about 2.9 tons per hectare. And that's about a 6.5%, yield improvement. So that got us kind of interested in maybe what we would see in that here. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then that same Guelph Ridgetown project that I was talking about before, they saw kind of an interesting trend where they saw a significant increase in yield in processing tomatoes following cover crops, but a more muted yield response in their cereals and oilseeds, like in their corn and their soybeans and their wheat, than they did in the vegetables. But what's also interesting is that now what they have seen is that following probably 2 or 3 cycles of this now, they can grow 200 bushel corn with half of the nitrogen impact because they've been able to increase the organic matter in those fields. And so I think they're looking at more fertilizer savings instead of maybe just increased yields. So that definitely comes with a value as well. So here's some work that we've done here at PEI. And so again, this is cover cropping before potatoes. So this is, in most of these cases, a forage that's germinated in August and a cover crop that's then planted late August, early September. And what we're looking at is, you look at primarily the 2 columns on the right-hand side. We've seen a general trend in 2020 of about a 2,400 weight per acre increase in marketable yields. That was statistically significant in 3 out of the 3 of those comparisons. But you see, there's a range here in effect, but none of the ones that were negative were statistically significant. And we definitely see, in a couple of fields, we saw fewer smalls. Some fields we saw an increase in sort of size profile. So that's definitely to the benefit. So that was encouraging. That's over 6 fields and was it 8 comparisons. So we said, okay, well, this was a multi-year project. When we get to our 2021 data, again, we're looking at, I had to exclude a couple fields from this analysis because they they had outlier results, both positive and negative, mostly due to some other mitigating factors in the fields, like in terms of compaction and siting and that sort of thing. But again, in general, we see the similar trend. We see a couple of the fields with a statistically significant increase in marketable yield and an increase in value. And we see that same sort of general trend of about 2,300 weight per acre and about $300 per acre in crop value. And what I can tell you is I don't have a table for our 2022 results yet because I just got the results last week, but I just quickly ran the numbers and it's almost exactly the same trend again this year over, I think, 9 fields and about 15 comparisons within 2022 yields. It's 2,600 weight per acre. So again, we're in a very similar trend year after year, which is quite interesting. And that, in Prince Edward Island, that 2,500 weight per acre is about a 7 to 8% yield improvement, which is in line with what we've seen in some of these other areas. So that increased payback and increased yields may be more impactful on high value crops like potatoes or other horticulture crops in the short term. But there is payback in some of these cereals and oilseed crops that may be more related to fertilizer savings. So if you're able to, account for more nitrogen credits and reduce nitrogen without compromising the crop, that definitely has value to the grower. There's more work needed locally to understand how much that nitrogen credit is, especially following some of these maybe forage crops which are fixing nitrogen. So I think we're very much interested in doing some more work on that here at PEI. In some areas, cover crops have depressed yields in certain years. Usually that's related to limited water availability. So if we're going into a drought year, particularly in Western Canada or the Midwest in the United States, where they have much lower annual precipitation than we do, that can be a challenge in terms of does the cover crop use up valuable water that the crop could have used, but that's something that generally isn't going to be as much of an issue here at PEI. So there's lots of cover crop options. How do you choose? How do you work with your producers? How do you work with people to determine what's the best option? It largely comes down to what crop are you following? What are you planting next year? What's your establishment window? What's your available equipment? And what's some of the costs that you're going to have in seed and establishment? This is a bit of a busy graph. The yellow is tillage radish, the yellow circles. The orange circles are spring cereal, and the gray on the right-hand side are winter cereals. What I really want to bring your attention to is that as we get later into the fall, your success in establishment decreases more rapidly for the radish than it does for the spring cereals. So early on in first half of September or late August, you're in a great window for getting radish established. But as we get later and later into the season, we can be into some more challenges. So that's just something probably to keep in mind as you're looking at what options you're going to plant and when, that sort of thing. The winter cereals do particularly well as we get out into the post October 1st area, late September, early October. If I go directly looking just at the spring cereals, so I pull the spring cereals out again. Early in the season, generally, we have a lot more success. As we get later into past October the 1st, where definitely the trend is for decreased yield, not decreased yield, but decreased percentage of cover in the field. So generally, I'm going to talk about this more in a second, but if you're using your barley or oats following a cover as a cover, they're really successful usually up to about the 1st of October, and then after the 1st of October, the winter cereals generally thrive better. One option that we can look at too, depending on your rotation and what crops you're growing, is getting your fall cover actually planted in the spring. So here in PEI and in other parts of the Maritimes, underseeding spring cereals is very common, and that's a great way of getting a cover established, especially if you're going to leave that out for another year for hay or as a mulch crop. That's by no means anything new, and there's lots of people doing that. For people that are doing like winter wheat or something like that, frost seeding of a red clover, potentially of timothy, can work. And it works quite well, generally in red clover. On some of the other forage species, maybe not so much. Timing is really important, so that's something to keep in mind. We've got a lot of growers here in PEI that have been experimenting and using Sudan grass and pearl millet as soil building crops in the last few years to break routine, disease cycles and that sort of thing. And alfalfa grass mixes can be underseeded really well under Sudan grass. So again, if you have an ability to, get alfalfa in your system, that's a way of getting an establishment with saving a pass, saving tillage, that sort of thing. And we've had quite a few growers here this year that included a brassica species along with those Sudan grass or pearl millet mixes, so that they had something green that stayed green after frost this fall. So I live in Kensington. There's some fields actually just not too far from my place that, all summer they looked like Sudan grass fields and they were getting mowed as such. But then when the Sudan grass started to turn brown and sort of die back in late September, early October with the first few frosts, Then the tillage radish underneath was kind of taking over and greening up and looking a lot better, and it's still green, and it's going to stay green till Christmas at least, probably. So that's a way of, there's a multi-species mix, which is only really, I think it was only 2 or 3 species, but it's a mix that keeps green in the field for the most amount of time. Interseeding, not something we've seen a lot in PEI, but I know there's a few people working on or interested in, particularly in corn, where, if we're doing grain corn in PEI or in most of the Maritimes, most of Atlantic Canada, we don't have a window for harvesting grain corn and putting on a cover crop after, in most cases, in most years. So can we get a cover established earlier that isn't going to be a weed issue, isn't going to subtract yield from the corn, but is going to create some green cover going into the winter? So timing is really important. Usually doing that interseeding at about the V4 stage is at top dressing time is about when most people do it. The photo on the right is 60-inch spacing on corn. And I know there's a few growers in the valley that have been working on this, and a few other places. And this photo, I think, is from Ontario. You may not want to go quite to that extent, but so it can be done under 30-inch spacing as well. But there's definitely an opportunity for getting underseeds, sort of interseeds done in those corn crops. It can be done in soybeans as well. Species that tolerate shade are going to be probably the best option there, and might be mixes. It might be monos. One species, it could be, there's options. If we're talking about more of our traditional fall cover window in PEI or in Atlantic Canada, we're looking at, so mid-August to early September. So your early harvested crops or your early forage termination. You do have a pretty strong list of options. So you got your oilseed, your daikon radish, tillage radish, which you see on the top right over here. You got brown mustard, spring cereals, winter canola is an option that I know a few people have been tinkering with, especially if planted in August. It can do really well the next year as it's a cover and a cash crop, same as winter wheat. Oats and peas, they can grow pretty quick, especially if they put them in early, and it could also be a grazing option for people that, maybe have cattle or looking for a grazing option. Same with annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass, it seems to be very dependent on, your soil type and whether you get it in early or not. Some years may work better than others. Kale, if you could put it in as a small amount in a mix, kale will stay green, past Christmas, and it can be a great grazing option, particularly if beef cattle or something like that. And as I say, mixes of brassicas and cereals can do quite well here. So mix oats with with radish or something like that to kind of fill in the gap. On the right hand, on the photo on the bottom right there, you'll see on the left hand side of the screen, it's just radish. And the right hand side, where it's a bit fuller, it's oats and radish. And you just see it sort of just has a bit more total cover. Even though the radish did well, it just filled it in a little bit more with having the oats in there. When we're talking about radish in particular, especially the daikon radish, so when planted early, you've got an opportunity for high biomass above and below the ground, and it's done quite well here. When those radishes decompose in the spring, you can see there's these little holes over here in the soil in the top right. That is good for water infiltration, so getting water into the soil and speeding up some of that infiltration, especially if we have a wet spring. They do help with soil compaction, but they don't work miracles. So they won't really bust through plow pans or really significant compaction layers, but they will help with improving the tilth and the sort of the surface compaction you'll see in fields. They can be susceptible to flea beetles. So again, if you're in rotation with other brassicas, something maybe to keep in mind, but they are a good break crop between cereals and other broadleaf species. And I think why a lot of growers in PEI have liked them is they're really easy to seed with low seeding rates and a seeder box right on your Lemkin or your Synchro or your tillage equipment. And you're 5 to 8 pounds, or sorry, more like 8 to 10 pounds per acre on radish or mustard, and it's easy. It's one pass and they're on. So the bottom right, those are tillage radish planted 1st of September. Photos from the 1st of November, and it's just a tremendous big bunch of biomass, and it was all done with one pass. Once we get more into September and looking at early October, and this is my experience in Prince Edward Island, but the ranges are probably not far off for most of the rest of the Maritimes anyway. We usually I don't usually recommend the radish after about the 10th of September in most years. This year, maybe people get away with it a little later, but you want to have that in usually August, early September. This is maybe where the spring cereals come into, into play as maybe one of the better options. And of course, winter cereals. So if you're planting something that you're going to grow out as a crop, that's not, it's a cover and a crop. So winter wheat, of course, highly used and quite successful in the Maritimes. We've done a little bit of work and some trials here with winter barley. It hasn't been very successful if it's planted end of September, 1st of October, but if planted sort of more like mid-September, like up to about the 20th, I think it can be more successful. This is some winter barley in the photo, and it looked quite good going into the winter, but then it just it didn't do quite as well in the spring. So I think it just needs a bit of an earlier establishment window. There's winter triticale, of course, which is a hybrid of rye and wheat. And then fall rye is kind of the gold standard. And especially if we're going past, about the 7th of October in this province, fall rye is really the heavy lifter. It will grow in 4 and 5 degree soil. It'll stay green through the winter. It'll stay green in the spring, and it'll start growing in April and really start getting going. It's sequestering nitrate in the spring when you get some of those heavy rains we can get in a PEI spring, where you're worried about any residual nitrate leaching again. So it does a great job there. And basically what I would say is that, your winter wheat, that's going to differ, your optimum and your last planting date is going to differ a bit by region. You may be able to get away with more in the Annapolis Valley than we can get away with in PEI, but there's usually by about the 7th to the 10th of October is about when people finish up with winter wheat here in PEI. So barley and oats don't consistently establish after the first week of October in most years. This year was a big, was a great cover crop year, and lots of oats and barley planted on the 10th of October. That looks tremendous, but that isn't probably the rule for most years. So making that right fall cover choice, fall rye has become really popular in some areas ahead of corn and soybean. So you can no-till rye, corn into rye as a relay crop, and you can also take rye off as silage. The photo I have on the screen, this is from my folks' own farm in PEI in sort of Summerside area, and they were able to take off about 4 bales of the acre of silage off of this rye in the end of May, and then no-till corn directly into that, and that enabled them, and then they were able to spray that with a herbicide a couple of weeks later on that Roundup Ready corn, and they had the best corn yield of the year of any field on this field, because the rye kept the weeds down, and it was easy to do without having any problems with the rye becoming a weed. So this is getting popular in some places, using rye as that sort of relay crop to keep the ground covered in the spring going into corn or soybeans. You may not want to look at rye on what I would call very wet land or poorly drained land, because if you can't get on that ground to terminate it, if that's what you're going to be doing, rye can grow quickly and get out of hand quickly. So that's just something to consider depending on where you're putting it. Ahead of potatoes in particular, if you're looking at stuff that you don't want to have to spray off in the spring, you don't want to have to terminate in the spring, you want it to self-terminate over the winter, the brassicas and the spring cereals work really well, because they do create quite a bit of biomass in the fall. They do hold the soil, but they'll be 95% of the time dead in the spring, and you won't have to do much to get land prepped. And if you're a livestock producer, grow an ergot resistant rye variety, maybe one of the newer hybrid rye varieties, so that's not a concern. So just before I finish, I just want to say, where have we seen adoption of cover cropping? So particularly looking at potato rotations, I work for the potato board. We've done some surveys with our growers, and you can see that, we've done 3 years of surveys. I've got a survey out right now that is in progress, but, we've generally seen that covers after potatoes has been fluctuating between that 40 and 50% range for a few years now. It's gotten up to a pretty good level, and I think we've got a lot of people, especially on the early harvested acres, to try and prioritize covers. But where we've seen a really big increase in the last few years is this covers before potatoes. Historically, a lot of land was plowed in the fall and left bare all winter. And what we're seeing now is we're up over 50% last year in terms of land getting covered before potatoes. From what I've seen driving around, as well as what I've seen from some of the responses so far, I think we're going to exceed that number in the covers before potatoes in 2021. So, of course, it was already outlined a bit of the stuff today in terms of incentives from the off-calf program on driving cover cropping adoption. So there's lots of opportunity to not only do something which is good for farmers' land, is good for their long-term viability, is good for the resiliency of their farms. There's also some assistance to help with. So just a quick acknowledgement of some of my partners. So my agronomy initiative for marketable yields, my funding partners is potato growers themselves, province of PEI with Agriculture Canada through the CAP program and Cavendish Farms. And then through the Living Labs, I've got also working with watershed groups, the East Prince Agri-Environment Association and Dalhousie on some of our individual trials. So with that, I guess I'm not sure, Rosalie, if I have time for any questions, but that's what I have for today. You can reach me at any of those ways there, peipotatoagronomy.com. Most, if not all, of our trial results are posted there. And there's also, regular agronomy updates. You can sign up for, to get those automatically to your email, that sort of thing. So that's how to get a hold of me.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Ryan. I learned so much. We are about to go into a coffee break, but there was one question that I thought maybe you could tackle before that. And then otherwise, we could save the questions for the panel. And so Nicole asked, what is an alternative to using herbicides to terminate winter rye in an organic system? Or do you not recommend winter rye in an organic system? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yep. So I don't do a lot with organics. We do have some organic potato growers in PEI, but I haven't done a lot of trial work with them. But I do know that rye is being used in some organic systems, particularly around soybeans. And instead of terminating with a herbicide, they're terminating with like a roller crimper. So they let it go a bit later. They plant the potatoes, they plant soybeans into their fall rye when it's alive. And then they, before emergence, they'll go through with, and when the rye is getting towards reproductive stage and it's not gonna, then they'll go through with the roller crimper to sort of break those stems. And then it forms a bit of like a compost mat on the top of the surface of the soil that then the soybeans grow into. So timing is really important, and it probably takes a bit of time and a bit of experience to learn how to do that properly. But there are definitely some people in the Midwest and in Ontario and stuff that are doing that in soybeans and corn and some other species.
Yeah, I've fiddled around with the roller crimper for years, and I have honestly never gotten it to work as well as everybody else seems to, but I think they're also all in much warmer regions. Right. So for here, somebody typed into the chat that you can mow it low once it starts to go reproductive if you don't have a crimper, which is totally true. For us in the valley, rye starts to flower at June 16th, which would be when you'd want to roller crimp it, and that is just too late for really most of your crops. Yep. Yeah, only works with late planted crops in Eastern Canada, says Matt Ramsey. Excellent. So Stefan Zehetner and his father have been farming in Hensel, Ontario since 1986. They grow corn, beans, wheat, rye, oats, and other crops on a smaller scale for cover crop seed. He went to Ridgetown College for a diploma in agriculture and then went to Olds College in Alberta for a degree in ag business. Throughout high school, Stefan spent his summers working on farms throughout Europe. After college, he spent his winters working on farms in Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. In his travels, he noticed that cover crops were a big part of agriculture all over the world, and that we were behind the 8 ball in Canada. So he decided to start Huron Cover Crops in 2013. And looks like you got your screen all shared. Looks great. I'll let you take it away.
All right. You can see everything. Sorry.
I can see what you probably want us to see.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I haven't used Zoom in a while, so bear with me here, but all right.
You might need to talk a little louder, Stefan. You're a little muted.
Okay. Turn it up. Can you hear me better now? Or not really?
Not really. I would say just kind of shout at the screen.
All right. Yeah, so my name is Stefan Zehetner. And yeah, so I got asked to do a quick presentation on cover crops in Canada. I'll try to make it as relatable to the Maritimes as possible, but a good portion of it is based on my work here in Ontario. This is our home farm, which is located just outside of Hensel, Ontario. We farm about 1,000 acres in Huron County. As Rosalie said, I spent a lot of my time in Europe growing up. My parents moved to Canada from Austria just a few months before I was born. So I was born in Canada, but just barely. Throughout high school, I worked on farms throughout Europe. In the summer, I pretty well spent every summer at my grandparents' farm in Europe, which we still have this farm. My aunt owns it now, but I can still go back and go there whenever I want to, which is always nice. I also worked, as I said, in Europe. So the top left and the bottom right. The top left is 2007, I believe it was. I worked in the Czech Republic, and the bottom right is a picture from the Czech. But top left is from Hungary in 2007, and the bottom right is from the Czech Republic in 2005. I did a seed corn harvest, I believe it was 2011 in Chile in South America, and then traveled throughout Chile and Argentina. I then flew to New Zealand for one winter and Australia for another winter. The wheat field shown here is Eric Watson's wheat field, which is the world record holder for winter wheat. I was lucky enough to get to spend a whole day with him. And the picture on the very right is the main reason I went to New Zealand in the first place, and that was to go check out a cross slot no-till drill. And that is Swedes or turnips direct drilled into a pasture. And yeah, it was a very neat trip and very, very interesting things to see. On our farm, my dad started no-tilling in the early 90s. We moved to strip till by about the mid to late 90s, mainly because we have very varying soil types. On our nicer soils, no-till was no problem. On our heavier clay soils, no-till, especially with corn, we just weren't getting the results that we had hoped. So we kind of moved to a strip till type system. So this is my dad no-tilling in the early 90s, no-tilling white beans on 15-inch rows, which was unheard of at home. And this was our first no-till corn planter, and we had 3 coulters per row working the soil ahead of the row. That worked okay, but if it was too wet, there was not enough time between the soil being worked and the planter pass. So then we switched to transtill, so strip tilling. That worked okay, other than the fact that without GPS, it wasn't always that easy to keep the planter on the row when you went back to try to plant into that strip. So then when I came back from Europe, I was using one of these these high-speed European discs, and I thought they worked really well. We learned quickly that there's a place for them, but it doesn't work everywhere. One bonus was I could use it to plant cover crops, and got me into planting cover crops at that point. Problem with it was in the springtime, if the ground's just a bit too wet, you end up with L-shaped roots and a compaction layer where that disc runs to. And we use it a bit, but not as much as we used to. If we make a mess of the field in the fall due to wet harvest conditions, we will use it, but we try to use it as little as possible anymore. We moved back to strip till again now with GPS. Strip tilling becomes a lot easier. I can make a nice fall strip, and then I can come back in the spring with the planter and plant right into those strips. And that seems to be working quite well. This is a picture of buckwheat and mustard and a bunch of different brassicas growing together. Crops that we grow on our farm: corn, soybeans, some edible beans, depending on pricing, wheat. rye for cover crop seed, oats and barley for cover crop seed. And then I play around with peas, faba beans, chickling vetch, hairy vetch. I grew sunflowers for a few years. I have a customer that grows them for me now. I grow buckwheat if I can as a double crop after a winter cereal if the time is there, and flax. And a lot of these I don't grow separately. They'll be grown in a mixture of, let's say, oats, peas, faba beans, chickling vetch, and flax. I'll plant them all together in the spring and then harvest that for seed and then resell that mix. I'll clean that mixture up and sell it for cover crop seed again. I started here in cover crops in 2013 after seeing how much further Europe and the rest of the world were than us in cover crops, and really had a belief that there was a need for it here as well. Started very slowly by buying full truckloads of seed out of the US. At that point, there wasn't that many places to get cover crop seed from. And then splitting it up between me and my neighbors to try to get the cost of the seed down. And after meeting and interacting with other people, and my customers realized there was probably an opportunity to do a lot more. I do a lot of research. It's not overly scientific by any means, but it's allowed me to figure out the right varieties and new species and try different things and just see how they do in our environment on a small scale. These are some of the examples here. I spent a lot of years working with faba beans and trying to get a faba bean that was a small enough seed size that was economical and easy enough to plant in a mix. Some of the really large seeded things don't do well in a mixture. So I think I spent 5 years trying to come up with a variety that was suitable size wise, and yeah, and I'm still not fully there on full field scale seed production on this variety, but I'm hoping in the next couple of years. I had a couple of years with some seed failures and things didn't work out the way I would like to with the weather, and the crop was not what I expected it to be. So why diverse covers? Green plants photosynthesizing, capturing CO2 and transforming it into biochemical energy in the form of sugars, carbon, which up to 60% is then transported to the roots and exuded into the soil. Actively growing green plants support the microbes that in turn create well-structured, friable topsoil with high nutrient availability and high water holding capacity. And I started learning about this when I was in Germany one summer at the Jena University in Germany, in Jena, Germany. It's a 15-year study looking at diversity in grasslands. And I've been to this site 3 times now, and every time I go, it's very intriguing, very interesting data that they're coming up with. Very well done. So there's an aerial view of the research site, and I've had the honor of being toured through there a few times now, and it's a very cool site to see. What they're doing there is comparing 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, all the way up to 60 different plant species mixed together with varying N rates, so 0, 100, and 200 pounds in N per acre per year. When they mixed, when they got to a mixture of 8 to 16 species, they produced more biomass with 0 nitrogen in their trials than they did when they only had 1 to 2 species in the mixture at 200 pounds an acre of N. So substantial nitrogen savings and coming up with the same final biomass at the end. So very interesting stuff. I realize this is grasslands and more like pasture idea, but I think the general idea stays the same even in a cropping situation. So this is one of my best customers at home here. He really takes the diversity to heart and does a good job of showing how multi-species mixtures have multiple benefits other than the fact that you're adding the nitrogen savings or fertilizer savings and weed control and things like that. He noticed that in his field, and I notice it all the time, walking customers' fields, that depending on the soil type and the available nitrogen and a bunch of different factors in your soil, even though you might plant the same mixture throughout the whole field, different areas of the field are going to have different amounts of different species growing. And the chances of you having a failure in any area of your field, or an area drowning out, or being too dry, or too compacted, or any of the following reasons why a cover crop might not work, the more species you have in your blend, the chances of you having that failure is very slim. You can see here he grows bio strips, so there'll be 2 strips of more high carbon plants and overwintering species, and then 2 rows at 7.5 inches of more high nitrogen plants and ones that will winter kill. And then he'll plant into that strip and have the green overwinter in between where the corn goes the following year. And he's been doing this for about 5 years now, and since he started, I think I picked up 5 or 6 of his neighbors now in the last couple of years that all want to do the same thing because he's having such great results. So very promising and very unique setup. He spent a lot of money on his drill and improving his equipment to be able to do this, but it's really worked out for him in the end. Different species that I like to work with. One that I found that works extremely well in the Maritimes is chickling vetch. There's only one variety of this seed available, and that's AC Green Fix. It is also probably the only species of cover crop that is has been produced specifically for the cover crop market. Chickling vetch really doesn't have much value other than as a cover crop. The seed itself has a neurotoxin in it, so it is poisonous to livestock if fed. The plant itself is fine to feed and actually has fairly good feed value, but not very high yield. As you can see, the leaves on it are fairly small, a lot of tendrils. But if you look at the right, the nodules that it is able to produce is pretty impressive. Especially because this plant is not native to the Maritimes. Most of those pictures were one's from New Brunswick and one's from PEI. The seed was not inoculated, and we're still getting great action. I mean, some of those nodules are the size of a quarter, and probably half the size of a golf ball. And I can't say I've seen any other species with that kind of nodulation in one growing season, especially when we didn't even know if the right microbes were there to inoculate these plants. Fixation Balanza clover is another one that seems to be doing quite well, especially in the Maritimes. Does well here as well, but it's done really well in the Maritimes for me. Extensive root system, but a very fine root system, much different than, let's say, red clover or a yellow blossom sweet clover, which has more of a tap root. This is a very fibrous root system. And it does sometimes have a slight tap down the center, but for the most part, a very fibrous root, and does a great job of top 5 to 6 inches of soil. The other nice thing about it is it mixes really well with cereal rye. And I have a lot of customers here in Ontario that will grow a mixture of cereal rye and Balanza clover in the fall, and then they'll take that to bale for silage, like Ryan was showing. Come spring, and really adds to feed value and protein levels in that feed. Also means that if they have a good stand of Balanza clover, they don't need to add any nitrogen in the springtime. So that saves them some money, and it dries really well. It has a large hollow stem, so once it goes through the mower and the conditioner, the stems are all broken open and actually dries very, very quickly. And makes great feed. So a lot of guys really happy with it. Huge biomass potential, especially if planted in the fall and harvested come springtime. Winter lentils is kind of a new one that I'm playing with. I played with it a few years ago. I played with spring lentils a few years ago, and not great results. But winter lentils seem to be doing very well. Some years the Austrian winter peas or like the Balanza clover won't overwinter, whereas these lentils will. But they don't produce the biomass that I'd like. So in a silage, like if you're taking the rye for feed, there isn't a lot of biomass that you're adding to that sample. So I'm still playing with it. I'm trying to find maybe a better variety, but very winter hardy anyways. It's done well for us that way. Phacelia is a great cover crop as far as holding nitrogen, and the nice thing about it compared to like a cereal crop is that it's not as high in carbon. It's great at sucking up a lot of nitrogen, but it breaks down very easily come springtime. The residue that's left is black, not white like a cereal crop like oats or barley, even though those would winter kill. But the residue that's left is a very light color, and the soil takes a lot longer to warm up come springtime. And Phacelia, like I said, is black. The residue that it leaves is black, and so is the residue of faba beans. So I have some vegetable growers in this area doing a mixture of faba beans and Phacelia, and they're very happy with it. I had a processing tomato grower that grew a crop of Phacelia after a crop of cabbages, and had a great stand, and was actually able to get through the whole tomato growing season without any extra nitrogen, because it was all available through the decomposition of this Phacelia, which was huge on tomatoes. They didn't have the same results every year just because the stand of the Phacelia wasn't as even. But if you get a nice even stand, they said it's pretty impressive how much they can turn back their nutrient application in the following crop. Buckwheat is something that I've been playing with for quite a few years. The most standard buckwheat has white flowers. I sourced this variety out of Asia a few years ago, and actually Japan has, compared to us in Southern Ontario, has probably the most similar climate that we have. And a lot of the species that I've been able to, not just species, but varieties that I've been able to get out of Japan and bring here have done extremely well compared to most of the stuff out of Europe. So I've got high hopes for this new buckwheat variety. I like the color. I think it's great for public interactions and gets people talking. Anybody that sees this, brightly pink fuchsia colored buckwheat field always has a million questions to ask how I got this and where it came from and what it is. And even from people that are not in agriculture, because it does look very pretty. So I think there's a lot to that, and getting that public perception that we're doing the right thing and that we're trying to help the environment and the pollinators and things like that is very important for us. So this is one of those species that I think helps with the public anyways. Even if they might not completely understand what we're doing, it looks very good. Cossack black oats. So this is a winter hardy oat. It is not nearly as winter hardy as winter rye or probably even winter wheat. I would normally never use this as a sole cover crop overwintering, just because the chances of it overwintering, especially on clay knolls, is very, very low. But where it really shines is where rye really struggles. So rye does not like wet feet. It does not like bottom ground. If water sits for too long, rye is dead and there won't be anything there come springtime. Whereas these Cossack black oats, they don't care. They'll sit underwater for 2 weeks, and come springtime, that's usually the best areas of the field. So in a mixture of, rye and black oats, or rye and black oats and some legumes, it just, again, the diversity makes sure that you have an even crop across the whole field, which is very important if you're going to try to cut nitrogen rates or fertilizer rates of any sort. Because if it's not even across the field, then you need to start variably applying your nitrogen, and not everyone has that ability, and I understand that. The other nice thing about it is it works up very easily come springtime. When you try, if you try to work up rye in the spring with a disc or any sort of tillage implement, you bring up a whole bunch of root balls, and you will spend most of your day trying to pound out those root balls to kind of get a seed bed established. Black oats, it can be as green as the rye field beside it, but you hit that once with a disc or anything and it just crumbles and there's nothing left. There's no root balls. Everything falls apart very easily. Very, very easy to work with. In a feed situation, I mean, you can see the flag leaf there on my arm. It it produces some extremely good biomass and very good feed quality, very low lignin, so it's digestible. Definitely helps in a feed mix with rye if you're going to be taking it for feed. Austrian winter peas are my favorite type of pea. Here in Ontario, if you use black forage peas, the following corn crop is going to have a negative yield impact. I think over 3 or 4 years, on average, we were losing 3 to 4 bushel an acre corn consistently after black forage peas. We don't really know why that is, but yeah, I don't recommend black forage peas as a cover crop here in Ontario, especially if your following crop is going to be corn. Yellow peas are a little bit better than black peas. They're at least a positive on corn yield improvement, but probably only 3 to 4 bushels, so exactly the opposite of what black peas were. Whereas Austrian winter peas, we've had as high as 16 to 24 bushel an acre increases on the following corn crop after a good crop of Austrian winter peas. And the interesting thing is when we do soil nitrate testing, there is no difference in the amount of soil nitrogen in the soil come springtime. So it has to be something to do with the microbes that it is feeding, or just the fact that, yeah, whatever it's doing in the soil has nothing to do with nitrogen. It is purely the fact that it is an Austrian winter pea compared to a black pea or a yellow pea. So yeah, it's been really good for us. The downside is most common Austrian winter peas cannot be used for feed because they're very high tannin content, so cattle find it bitter. Excuse me. But I have 4 new varieties now that I'm trialing. They're much more winter hardy, so we're getting greater success of them overwintering here. They're smaller seeded than the old common Austrian winter pea is, and they're tannin free, so you can add them now into your rye mixes and rye and balanza clover, let's say, and Austrian winter peas, and you can feed that to cattle, and they really like it, and it's actually sweet. They probably like it a lot better than they do just straight rye, from what I've heard from customers, and guys are really happy with it, especially organic guys. If they can get a much bigger crop of rye silage come springtime with some of these peas and other legumes mixed in than if they were just growing rye by itself. Hairy vetch, yeah, I've talked about it a little bit. It's some of these new varieties that I'm trying, very winter hardy. Downside to hairy vetch compared to, let's say, Austrian winter peas or balanza clover is that there's some hard seed, and then vetch can be a bit of a problem later in the rotation. I have some growers that absolutely love hairy vetch, and I have some growers that absolutely hate hairy vetch. I fall in the first category. I've got along really well with it. It's actually not that hard to deal with once you figure it out. Our only real problem with it is sometimes it'll show up in our IP soybeans, but we figured out that an application of Reflex at flowering will take care of the hairy vetch. And actually, the one year I had a test plot and the hairy vetch got away on me because it was supposed to go to corn and ended up going to beans because it got so late. I couldn't see the soybeans anymore through all the hairy vetch. We did an application of Reflex. 7 to 10 days later, there wasn't much vetch left above the beans, and that strip of beans was actually some of the best beans we had, even though we couldn't see them for 2 weeks or longer. So caution, I guess, with any vetch variety, but the potential is definitely there, and increases feed value when mixed with rye as well. So what we do here at home, and what my customers do here in Ontario, for the most part, the bulk of my cover crop sales is after cereal harvest, so usually after wheat, barley, rye harvest in our area. Most guys will try to get in there as soon as possible after the combine leaves the field. That allows you to keep living roots in the ground as long as possible. It allows you to get ahead of other weeds and volunteer wheat. It allows you to grow warm season species. If you wait too long, a lot of the warm season species probably aren't worth the money. And that allows you to have a lot of flowering plants, which later in the season maybe isn't as much of an option. Oops. So there's an example of a very diverse mixture that I would grow on my farm. I usually grow everything that's left over at the end of the year and last year's leftovers or whatever and throw it all together. And that's what I end up with. I think that's 32 different species in there actually. And we've had some of our best corn crops after these extremely diverse mixes on very little fertilizer. This is what that looks like. Huge biomass. Seems like it's going to be too much to plant corn into, but by the time springtime comes, so this is late fall here, first frost took out all the spring cereals and things like that, but still lots of green there. That's what the soil looks like underneath it. Lots and lots of roots, lots of life, great aggregation. And that's what it looks like come springtime. And this was never burnt off, no chemical applied. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see I installed some strips. On the left-hand side of the screen, I left it no-till. Yeah, I took these to harvest results in the corn. I think the right-hand side of the field on strips did 263 bushel an acre, and the left-hand side no-till was around 257. So very, very good results. I think 120 pounds of N applied, no P and K. Yeah, very, very happy with it. And the interesting thing, the year we did this trial, we had vomitoxin problems in corn in our area. Our fields that were planted after some of these multi-species mixtures, for whatever reason, we had a lot less issues with mycotoxins than a lot of our neighbors did. Does it have anything to do with the cover crop? I don't know, but the corn plant looked healthy all year long and did really, really well. The last 6 or 7 years, I have been playing with, I think this might be a little out of order, but playing with cover crops in the Maritimes. I had the opportunity to fly out and speak with a bunch of McCain's customers. And after they heard me talk, they said, well, do you want to be our seed supplier? You seem to know what you're talking about. We want to deal with somebody that, that knows what's going on. And we've had really good success. We run 2 main mixes that are around 15 species, and they're available in a 1-year mixture or a 2-year mixture. So for guys that are not growing or are 2 years out and only want to plant the cover crop once, the 2-year mixture seems to be doing quite well. A lot of other growers still like just a 1-year cover crop and then maybe going with mustard or something like that in the 2nd year. Yeah, we've had some great results. I'm sure Ryan talked about some of that stuff. I don't have all the yield data on all that because I'm not a potato grower. I don't know that much about potatoes, but I do know cover crops, and yeah, it's done really well. And these are some examples of what that looks like. Full season cover crops in PEI and New Brunswick for the most part. Lots of diversity, lots of biomass there, and yeah, it does really well. I think those 2 slides were a little out of order, but sorry, I apologize about that. I kind of made this in a rush late last night. So going back to what we do here, post cereals rather than early. What I said previously is that most guys will plant early, but I have a handful of customers that prefer to wait, especially customers with manure, or if they have perennial weed problems in the field that they want to get rid of. So then we'll target the last week of August or the first week of September. This allows time for weed control, as I said, allows time for them to remove the straw, apply the manure or compost. The downside to it is it limits diversity. The later you get, the less species options you have. You're going to have a fallow period where there's nothing growing in your soil. And a lot of times, by the time we get to the end of August, if we don't have a lot of rain in August, that soil is so dry, we barely have enough moisture to get the cover crop to germinate. It's also a lot harder on a no-till drill if you're trying to plant into very dry, hard soil. So this is me planting soybeans through a crop of rye. I do not roller crimp or anything. I have not had any success with the roller crimping. So I plant direct. So this is me planting through straight rye, and then me planting through a mixture of rye and hairy vetch. Downside to the hairy vetch, you can see on the left-hand side, I had to end up making some brackets to push the vetch to the side because it always wanted to wrap around my no-till coulters out front. But the interesting findings on this plot was where I had the hairy vetch in the strips, soybeans yielded between 6 and 8 bushel an acre more than where the straight rye was. And I think that to a certain extent, there was probably too much of a lack of nitrogen on the straight rye, and that little bit of nitrogen really came back to boost the soybeans late in the season. They were much darker green all year long where the vetch was, and the yield at the end of the day showed us that. This is what those soybeans look like coming up through that rye. In some of these cases, the biomass was almost a bit too much, but the soybeans seemed to do quite fine. You can see we had probably 4 inches of straw laying on top of the soil, and the soybeans do eventually poke through all that. That's what that soil looks like underneath that mat of rye. Extremely high water infiltration rates, over 4 times as high as what we had on another part of the field where there was no cover crop. And those soybeans just moved along and never stopped. And very, very little weed problems. The weeds seem to struggle more to come through that big mat of rye than the soybeans do. Order again too, I apologize. So we did early, late, and then what I like to do is a combo, and these last 2 pictures were supposed to be after this, but so we'll go in right after the combine. We tend to grow soybeans after corn or after wheat, and I'll go in right away after the combine leaves and plant fast growing species like mustard, buckwheat, sorghum sudan grass, pearl millet, and radishes. They will come up really very, very quickly. By the mid to late September, I will come back in, probably early to mid September, I'll come back and plant another cover crop through that first cover crop of overwintering species. And we've had extremely good results with that. Downside to it is we have to plant that field twice before we ever plant our next cash crop. My dad always shakes his head, but after some of the results we've had, it pays. So we've been really happy with it. So yeah, as I said, early I'll come in buckwheat, sorghum, pearl millet, mustard, sunflower, radish, and then later on I'll come in with rye, triticale oats, and hairy vetch, and sometimes some clovers and things like that to get the overwintering biomass. And then that second planting pass kills this first planting pass. They'll all get crimped over. So this is what that looks like, that first planting of the fast growing species. Sometimes I've played around with mowing it. I added this picture here to show the type of biomass that we were able to achieve in about 5-6 weeks. Mow that down, and then I come back in with my no-till drill, and then I usually plant my overwintering species in twin rows so I can plant my following cash crop in between those twin rows. And one year we had, I think, somewhere between 10 and 11 bushel increase on doing this combination approach compared to just a straight oat cover crop that I did on one block of the field. Soybeans for us, we've tried a whole bunch of different things, aerial application at leaf drop, very mixed results. And a lot of that comes down to who's flying the airplane. We've had better results with a drone, mainly because we can get that seed right where we want it, and wind is less of an issue because we're much closer to the crop canopy when applying it. Late, we'll drill after soybeans if harvest is early enough. You know, if we're in September here in Ontario, oats, barley, Austrian winter peas, and hairy vetch are all still options on the table. And that's great if you're going to follow with corn and not going to wheat or anything. In corn, we did a lot of this when I first started. We had really, really good results the first 2 years. And then it really went downhill after that, interseeding wise. I don't really recommend it anymore unless you're willing to really drop your population. And I have some growers that grow leafy silage varieties that are planting at 26 to 28,000 population in corn, and that seems to work. We've been playing with some 60-inch twin row corn. That works great for the cover crop, but maybe not the best yields in corn. Mixed results, let's put it that way. But what I like to do is after corn harvest, I will spread 60 to 80 pounds an acre of cereal rye on top of corn ground. And we've had really good results with that. I've spread it on top of a foot or more of snow, and come springtime, the field is green. So this is an example of interseeding gone well. Bunch of different grasses and clovers and alfalfa, brassicas all growing under this corn crop. That's what it looked like at harvest time. And this is me spreading rye with a fertilizer spreader after corn harvest in the fall. It's cheap, it's quick. I can cover a lot of acres in a hurry. And if the weather cooperates, we've had some really, really good stands doing this, and very few failures, I would say. Is it as even as if you would drill it? Probably not, but we're getting green where we would like it for the most part, and it's worked well. As you can see here, you would think that was all drilled, but that was all broadcast with a fertilizer spreader. On the right hand side, we went over the field. One of the first nights we were down to 6, 7 below, and the corn stalks were really frozen. We went out with a flat roller and rolled the corn stalks down, and that seemed to improve the germination of the rye a little bit, even though we didn't incorporate it into the soil. We just pushed the residue down onto the soil, which in turn probably covered some of the rye seeds a little bit better. Yeah, I would say that's my main presentation. I apologize it wasn't maybe as organized as it could be, but I just got back from Florida late last night, helping my dad repair his house after the hurricane, and tried to put this together as quickly as I could so I didn't leave you guys hanging. And I'm willing to answer any questions anybody has. So
that was fantastic. Thank you, Stefan. Put together in a hurry, but I still learned a whole bunch, so that was really great. I'm going to invite Ryan to turn on his camera, and we're just going to move right into the panel. And Sonny Murray is going to be joining us as well. So for those of you who don't know Sonny, he is our berry specialist at Perennia, but has a world of experience with cover crops, and has over 20 years experience in the agriculture industry, working with producers on crop inputs and seasonal planning. So Sonny's experience includes nutrient management planning, soil fertility, weed management, crop rotation, cover crops, and soil conservation. So he's just here to add a little bit more local context as well. But yeah, so there were a few questions that came up in the chat and they came up in the Q&A. There's been some discussion in the Q&A, so folks, I do encourage them to go over there to just kind of see what people are chatting about. But first, Stefan, a question from Patrick. Do you have any problem bringing in new species into the province from an environmental point of view? Like a potentially invasive species would likely trigger an environmental impact assessment in New Brunswick, for example.
Yeah, so like the seed that came in from Japan, especially, it comes in very, very small quantities. I think buckwheat, I started with 200 seeds, and I took those 200 seeds and multiplied that seed over years and years. And this year I should have enough to plant about 3 acres. And now that I'm at, if that allows me a fairly good harvest, that 3 acres should be enough to plant, 15 or 20 next year. And now we're finally at a point where we're coming up with some volume that I can do it at a larger rate. So when you're bringing in seed in that small quantities, it's very easy to go through it yourself. It goes through all the testing and a bunch of things involved, and CFIA has to inspect everything and all that. But I mean, in lot sizes that are that small, very easy. Some of the stuff that comes through Europe, I have to assume that the testing and things that are done have been done properly. You know, CFIA always wants to have a look at anything that comes in, which is fine, and that's a good thing, I think. I still take a very close look. Anything that I plant for seed production, at least anyways, I keep a pretty close eye on it to make sure that I'm not introducing anything I don't want to introduce. Be a quick way to lose a lot of customers. So
That's fair. That's fair. So you mentioned multi-species mix, so that 30-way mix kind of made my eyes pop. Stefan and Ryan and Sonny, I'm hoping you're going to jump in here to talk about your experiences with them. Do you like them? Do you worry about things going to seed? You know, you have stuff maturing at different times, so management can be tricky. If you guys could kind of just chat about that.
I'll jump in. I have some experience with some mixes. Typically, they were planted after winter wheat was coming off. So in our area, that second week of August, you have some species in there that are very quickly to establish, and you got some that are a little bit later to establish in the mixes that I've worked with. And because you have a sit population, maybe the weed control or the weed suppression by that cover crop mix isn't quite as good as what I would like to see. So I think you got to work with your supplier, come up with the right mix. I was just a little bit disappointed. You know, you have this population, you have one species that's quick to establish over here and over here, but then you have some, you know, almost bare soil in between, and the weeds quickly came up and overtook that area in between. Later on, you have the species that were quick to establish going to seed on you almost, and the other ones are just coming online. So I think it's easy to get negative about them. I think you have to work with the cover crops and select the right species in order to make them work in your situation and on your farm. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to add something to that.
I would agree that coming up with the right mix is not always easy, and there's definitely a learning curve to it. But the more you play and the more you try, and you know, come up with a small base mix of, you know, maybe if it's 2 or 3 species that you know are doing well, and slowly add things to it. And the longer you play with it, the more you learn as to how it goes. Even the McCain mixes that I sell in the Maritimes, it changes from year to year. Every year we try to throw something new in, at least on some of the acres, see how it does. If it does well, the grower's happy with it, we'll add it to the following year's mix. If it doesn't do well, or we start noticing it's not really fitting into the mix the way we would like it to, we drop it again and try to fill it with something else. And yeah, it's a constant changing battle, I guess. And it depends on year to year, you know, depending on the weather that you get and different things. A lot of the problems with mixes that guys find too is how deep do I plant it? You know, if you something like a large seeded faba bean needs to be planted deep enough to get enough moisture for that seed to germinate properly. But then if you're down 1.5 to 2 inches, something small like Phacelia is probably not going to show up. So you know, there is some compromises there, and planning into, you know, having some moisture in that top inch and a quarter of soil profile is very important to get a lot of these really diverse mixes to come up very evenly, I guess.
I'd say in my experience, it's again, it's trying to find what fits best for the production system and the rotation and that sort of thing. So in preceding potatoes, there's been historically a lot of people grew forages ahead of potatoes, right? And to help feed next year's potato crop, to break disease cycles, that sort of thing. And then in recent years, there's been a lot of work on sort of these multi-species mixes or some sort of non-forage or traditional forage cover ahead of potatoes. And some of those have been, I'd say, quite successful, and some of them maybe a little less so, and people are tweaking and that sort of thing. The problem with late season, or the problem with like warm season grasses and some of the warm season annuals that are in some of these mixes is if you're, you can't really plant in PEI until mid to late June. So if you're looking for a full season cover, you've got probably a couple months of ground ahead of it that's maybe open, so it doesn't maximize your window as much. And then if you're going in after a grain, and the grain doesn't get off until the 20th of August, then again, if your mix has a lot of warm season stuff in it, then that can be, you can kind of start running out of time too. So I've tried to focus with growers a little bit, just in trying to dial in what works best for their timing and their rotation and what they're growing in rotation. We've done a little bit of trial work looking at like very diverse mixes versus single species or say 2 species mixes, and we really haven't seen any difference in yield in the potato crop. It's been, and not really much difference in terms of soil either. But again, in some of those cases, it's that multi-species mix is maybe only in the ground for 3 months, and then it's effectively terminated, and it didn't get in super early. So maybe it didn't have enough time to do its job either. So I found what's really been usually works the best is if they can find something that's going to get them their maximum biomass, and whether that's 1 or 2 species, but something that fits the timing really well and isn't going to be a problem for next year's crop. In potatoes particularly, we're worried about a lot of soil-borne disease issues. You don't want to have anything that's going to multiply any problems. So things like radishes have done really well here in terms of breaking some of those disease cycles. And oats are usually pretty good at that sort of thing. So a lot of like 2 and 3 species mixes there seem to have worked pretty well.
That's great, guys. A question has come in on the Q&A. Do you have experience working with cover crops as a strategy to remediate poor soils not currently used in production? So this would be probably after land is being cleared, for example.
I've had a couple growers that we've talked about this. The biggest problem is most stuff that's been recently cleared in PEI, or that's I'm going to say newer land. Most of that land in my area is quite low pH. And so then that can sometimes really limit what you're going to get in terms of crops. So, you might get away often, like some of the cereals might do okay, or especially like oats or something, but a lot of other stuff won't. So you have to be, you'd hopefully want to have some soil tests to kind of manage that. If it's just taking over, if you're trying to kind of freshen up ground that maybe was just underused for a while, like say old pasture land, which maybe get a few bushes growing up in it or something, it may not be quite the same situation. So you may have more flexibility there.
Stefan, Sonny, you guys got anything to add to that?
Yeah, around home, we have the exact opposite problem. Most of our pH is around 8, 7.5 to 8, but there's not much new land to be found in southwestern Ontario, but every once in a while, like a pasture or something comes out and out of production, and we've done some pretty interesting things there, usually with fast growing species, so mustards, radishes, buckwheat, things like that, to try to and lower carbon species, especially if you're coming out of pasture, try to break down all the residue that's there and things like that. That seems to work well, and then a lot of guys will be able to no-till right into that the following year.
Sonny?
Yeah, I've had a little experience. Typically, what I tell the growers is, if you can't grow a decent cover crop, then you're not ready to put that land into production to grow a cash crop. So let's spend a minute and get this right before we throw some more money at a bad situation. Typically, I'll put in some winter rye and make sure I have a legume in there as well, so that way we get some nitrogen into the system. Winter rye tends to tolerate that low pH a little bit better, and some clovers are better at lower pH as well. So just like to get some nitrogen, get some life going into that soil beforehand. Also, I'm not quite sure of the question, but I had a lot of experience working with soils that were maybe a little bit too abused, and cover crops, of course, work great in that situation, trying to get some life back into those fields. Kind of playing off of what Ryan was saying there, I've had a little bit of luck with planting mustards first thing in the spring, getting out there super early, and of course your mustards can tolerate that cold temperature. And then plowing those in middle of June and then going to a sorghum or a pearl millet, that warm season type stuff. And that way you're controlling some of those diseases and soil-borne diseases and wireworm as well. But I like what you said about putting maybe a brassica in with that warm season grass, so that you have something to cover you through the fall. As soon as you get a frost on that warm season grass, it tends to melt on you. So kind of interesting.
We've done a little bit of research work here, specifically on biofumigation with mustards, and where just as you said, Sonny, like the timing works really well if you can get it planted by mid-May, so that you'll be at peak biomass on the mustard by end of June, and then you can incorporate, and then you can then you got to wait about 2 weeks after incorporation on the mustard, if it's a high glucosinolate biofumigant, and then put your warm season grass mix in after. That timing kind of maximizes the amount of time you got something green in the ground, but also, you are if you're going ahead of high value crops like hort crops or potatoes or something, then you're also addressing some of those concerns too.
I'm going to jump in here. Have you tried planting right after incorporating your mustard?
We have, or there have been people that have done it. It's hit or miss. If it's big seed, if it's like stuff that's just like barley or oats as a very coarse cover, it's probably okay. If it's small seeded stuff, it generally seems to be challenged, particularly if it's a very high glucosinolate mustard, like a bred specifically for biofumigation. Yeah, you can definitely have a lot of emergence issues right after.
Okay, interesting. I've always told people to wait, but I was talking to some people through the fall, and they said, no, go ahead, plant it, don't wait. So just wondering what your experiences was.
I think it comes down to what I've seen too is if you got the good biofumigation effect, it's like if you had put it in the wet soil or moist soil and you got that full biofumigation. It's also different if you put it in the somewhat drier soil, and then maybe you didn't get that full effect, and you probably could go in pretty soon after, because it's not as much of it there. So it's a little bit down to the year or two, that sort of thing. You were talking about remediation there too, Sonny, and we were talking about improving. Like one issue that I see a lot in potato production, but it's also in a lot of other production, is compaction. And that's where I've become a really big fan of alfalfa ahead of, or if you can get it into potato rotations, it does a really good job of breaking up compaction, but it also fixes a lot of nitrogen. So if you've got soils that are, decent pH and can manage alfalfa, and also then if you have the opportunity to work with a farmer, and alfalfa makes terrific feed for both dairy and beef producers. So I'm a big fan of alfalfa if you can find a way to make it work in your rotation.
You worry about sclerotinia in rotation with potatoes, Ryan?
Alfalfa?
Well, of any of your legumes?
Oh, I don't see an issue with sclerotinia with legumes. I see an issue with if you've got rotations that are say potatoes, soybean, and radish or mustard and stuff, then we can get into some sclerotinia issues, but don't usually see it as a problem with legumes. Potatoes and soybeans back to back can be a big issue with white mold.
I'm glad we kind of circled back into some of those summer annuals from your talk earlier, Ryan, because I had questions. So if you're underseeding your brassicas and your legumes with pearl millet or sorghum Sudan grass, are you still mowing the summer annual? Or are you dropping your seeding rate so that they establish? Because they're quite competitive, those summer annuals.
Yeah, so the situation I was describing, there's a few growers here that they're planting it sort of mid-June to early July, like last 2 weeks of June. And they're planting, say Sudan grass and pearl millet at about 20 to 25 pounds an acre combined on the two. And then they're putting in about 5 pounds an acre of radish or something like that. And they probably mow that summer annual of once or twice during the season. And, I saw a few cases where you didn't really see much other than the Sudan grass going by. And then And then, excuse me, once it started getting to the end of September, even before they get frosted, they really slow down once you get into some cooler nights and stuff. And then that's when you could see the radish starting to kind of poke up and fill in the holes a bit more. And then now you drive by and it's all just radish. So radish does have the ability, I find, to do that in some of those mixes.
That's great, thanks. We've got time for a few more questions if people want to type them into the chat. Otherwise, I can ask questions all day. Sonny, do you have a question?
I have a question for Stefan. You mentioned Austrian winter pea. We played with it a little bit here. Sometimes it comes through the year winter beautifully. Sometimes it totally winter kills. What's the correct seeding date on that if you want it to overwinter? It tends to be quite sluggish in the spring too, coming back. Just wondering what your experience is.
One thing we've really noticed is it needs a companion. So if you're just planting Austrian winter peas, the chance of it overwintering is pretty slim. If you can get a crop of oats up to kind of protect the small plants over the winter, that helps. Some rye helps it get through the winter as well. I like oats, rye, and Austrian winter peas. And it doesn't need to be high rates of the cereals, but there just needs to be something there to cover them up. What I've had, I don't know what the planting date would be out there, but we've found that going into the winter, you want your Austrian winter pea to be about 3 to 4 inches tall. And once they get to be bigger than that, they don't really winter very well. And if they're a whole lot smaller than that, they don't overwinter really well. So it is kind of a playing game. Like around here, I would say probably the first 2 weeks of September to maybe the 20th of September, depending on what the weather's like and things like that, would be the ideal time to plant Austrian winter peas. The other thing is you need to plant them relatively deep, like ideally more than 1.5 inches, like 2 inches, and they'll come out of the ground at 2.5 inches too. So and it's usually the underground, the stuff that's still underground that's keeping it alive over winter. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. What time that would be? Probably closer to the end of August, first week of September in the Maritimes. I would say at least a week or two earlier than we are here.
For the sake of comparison, what's your official ideal planting date for winter wheat? Your government official?
Would be, probably I would never plant it before the 15th of September. We would be like the last 2 weeks of September, the first 2 weeks of October would be our ideal planting window, in my opinion. Yeah. If I could pick a day, I'd pick like October 5th. But yeah, somewhere around there.
I had a question for Stefan as well around the black oats. So that one I find interesting because, again, looking for options. Some people are scared off by winter rye, feeling it's going to be a lot of management and everything, and how aggressive it can be sometimes. And but I know in, say, the UK and stuff, they have a lot of issues with black oats as being a weed problem. So are you pretty happy with how well you can control it with herbicides and that sort of thing?
Yeah, we've had no problems. A lot of times black oats will get confused with wild oats, right? Because wild oats are black too. Actually, black oats in Europe, they'll call it like translation from German would be like rough oats or like a sand oat, and they're black, and that's probably the main cover crop species they use over there. They won't use like the tan milling oats that we would use here. They would only use those use that specific kind of oat, and I don't know what the Latin name is off the top of my head right now, but yeah, we've had no issues at all. Now we're not in a very high cereal rotation area. I mean, if one of your main crops is a seed crop of oats, let's say, then maybe you don't want to be introducing something that could very well look like a wild oat and use some seed contract money or anything like that. But at home here, no problems at all.
Right on.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was super insightful, and I think I can speak for everyone and say that we certainly learned a lot.